Hello there, Wahlburgers. Today we're going to be skipping through about, 22,000 years of history real quick so we get a good basis of the things that we need to know before we really start digging into some American history. So that's why I have it labeled conveniently. Okay, let's get started. Some of the big questions that we are going to be looking at for this week. One, what was the purpose of colonization? So why were these European powers coming over, and colonizing? We're going to talk about this thing called the Columbian Exchange. How important is it? How does it change the world? And finally, we'll start talking about England coming over and colonizing. And so we have this one colony named Jamestown. And I'm curious, what are the problems that Jamestown had? And how does it end up surviving? So we talked about this a little bit last week, the early peoples and how they came to America. So 20,000 years ago, again, sea levels were way down, and we had this land bridge between what is now Alaska and Russia. And we believe these people migrated over. These were nomadic people, or people who moved from place to place in search of food and water. Probably they were chasing a herd of woolly mammoths or something like that. As these people started to settle, came over into North America and then eventually South America, most of these early Americans were gatherers and hunters. They would move around with their herds as they went from place to place or as food became more scarce or more plentiful. But eventually we do see some groups that do start to build farms and cultivate plants. Agriculture. The big crops that we see would be corn, or sometimes we'll refer to it as maize, beans, and squash. These three things, corn, beans, and squash, were sometimes referred to as the three sisters. We do see some major empires that get started. We have the Inca, you have the Maya, you have the Aztec. More North America, you have the Adena. But a lot of these end up falling before the Europeans even arrive. So there we go. There's our early American peoples slide nutshell in about 30 seconds. So, okay, we got to talk about the big guy here, Christopher Columbus. And 1492, of course, is this year that we're really, really focusing on, or at least starting our studies from. And when we get to 1492, yes, everyone likes to say, he was trying to prove that the world wasn't flat, da-da-da-da-da. That's really a lie. Not a big thing. But ultimately what he was trying to do was trying to get to Asia quicker. And so his idea was, let's go west. Everyone was going east. You either had to walk or you had to sail around Africa. Kind of a pain. Let's just go west. So he set sail August 3rd, 1492. I know how to talk. But ultimately, about a month later, lands on the island that we now know as San Salvador, where we meet the Taino people, the people that we talked about briefly last week. These natives were friendly. They had never seen a big ship like this before, let alone a person who was had slightly less pigment than them. So they treated them very friendly. As news spread that there was all these new lands out west, more and more monarchs and the European powers became interested in exploring and gaining more lands. And with that, hopefully, getting more money. So we see the beginnings of colonization. So a nice fancy term or definition there. The establishment of distant settlements controlled by a parent country. So for right now, when we look at parent countries, we're really looking at three. Spain is going to be one. France will be another. And the big one we're going to focus on, for obvious reasons, is going to be England. And they all form these are our parent countries over in Europe. And they then in turn start colonies over in the New World. So Spain is using this New World to primarily make money. Ideally, they were trying to find gold and silver just kind of lying around. So that's a very labor-intensive job. You need people to actually mine and dig up stuff. So originally, they were using the American Indians as slaves, ultimately, and we have very cruel depictions of what the Spanish were doing to them. Unfortunately, many of those natives died of disease. And so now we start to see the introduction of the slave trade as well. not huge like we maybe think of it in early American history, but there were starting to be African slaves coming over forcefully. We also have the beginning of what we call the Columbian Exchange, which is the global transfer of things. So here we have a nice, beautiful picture illustrating this Columbian Exchange. So as Europeans are coming to the New World, to North America, they're getting these things that they had never seen before. Corn, potatoes, peppers, pineapples, chocolate, honestly. Can you imagine a world without chocolate? Or avocado toast, apparently. So all these new cool things were actually coming to Europe and Africa. And actually, the Europeans benefited from it. They became healthier because this is new food. But at the same time, stuff was coming from Europe and Africa to the New World. So here we have some examples. Grapes, bananas, olives, coffee, livestock, grains. But also very important here is you have diseases coming over. Smallpox, the flu, typhus, measles. I mean, you can read there. And it's still a thing that's actually going on today. We're still having things transfer from these continents that normally wouldn't be able to. So as these parent countries start coming over, they start settling in certain areas. So Spain, they named their new land creatively New Spain, but we see them in Mexico or in the Southwest United States or even Florida. France, again, being very creative, they settle New France, parts of Canada and the central United States. And then finally, the English, when they finally get a foothold here, we have these British colonies along the eastern coast that we're eventually going to really establish them as the 13 colonies. So let's talk England. The first colony that we typically talk about when it comes to England is Roanoke. It is the first English colony in the New World, settled in 1587. However, 2 years later, when a supply ship finally arrives to help them out, the colony mysteriously disappears, and we're still not quite sure what's happened, even after all these years later. However, turn of the century in the 1600s, King James I grants a charter, basically royal permission, for the Virginia Company to create a colony. And so the colony that they settle is called Jamestown, creatively named after King James. And it's England's first successful colony in the New World. The first few years, though, we see survival being very, very difficult. We often call their first winter the starving time, because people were starving. So out of the 600 colonists that arrive in 1609, we see 60 survive the winter. Not a very reassuring amount of time there. And so how do people get out of this? Well, we have this wonderful quote here. He that will not work shall not eat. A lot of these colonists that first came over were kind of upper class. They weren't expecting to work a whole lot. And so because of that, they weren't building shelters. They weren't farming. They weren't hunting, which is why we kind of have this whole starving time thing. So eventually, this John Smith captain, we've all heard about him before, comes in, basically says, hey, if you're not going to pull your weight, well, we're not going to feed you. So that changes that mentality that a lot of people started really pitching in. So eventually, we do get Jamestown being successful. England would have loved to have found gold and silver. Definitely. But Virginia, not full of that stuff. And by that, I mean it has none. However, they do find one crop that turns actually profitable. Tobacco. So growing tobacco is a huge thing. I mean, you might see fields of it actually around in this area, or if you go down to Lancaster there. But growing tobacco requires a lot of labor. And so to do this, to try to make it easier on especially those people who are wealthy and are trying to turn a profit, we get these people called indentured servants. These were people who would come over from England but couldn't necessarily afford a boat ticket. And so in order to get a boat ticket, they said, hey, I'm going to work for this person for so many years, maybe 4 to 7 years. And after those 4 to 7 years, they're pretty much a free individual person. Maybe have a little bit of money saved up, but for the most part, yeah, they're almost, in a sense, kind of slaves, but they knew that they were going to eventually get out. Over time, though, we see indentured servants become less and less, but we still have more and more work to do. So because of that, we again start seeing slavery introduced to the New World, and specifically Jamestown. So slavery is introduced to help provide labor and but it becomes more popular as the colony becomes wealthier. So here we have England's first successful colony. We're going to dig into a little bit more Jamestown as the week progresses. But here we go. First video. Done. Thanks. Have a fantastic